So we're very delighted to host Phyllida Barlow in conversation tonight with Frances Morris on the occasion of the sculptural installation Doc, the Tate Britain Commission for 2014, supported by Sotheby's, which is Phyllida's most ambitious work to date, and taking up most of the Duvines and challenging visitors to negotiate a way through the space and to actively look at the installation. For over 4 decades, Phyllida Barlow has made imposing large-scale sculptural installation using inexpensive, everyday materials such as cardboard, fabric, timber, and plaster. Her unique work is focused on experimentation with these materials to create bold and colorful three-dimensional collages. Phyllida Barlow studied at Chelsea School of Art in London and then at the Slade School of Fine Art, where she later became a professor and influenced many now prominent artist careers. Her recent international major exhibitions include the Venice Biennial, Carnegie International, Des Moines Art Center, and the Norton Museum of Art, all in 2013. She became a Royal Academician in 2011. Frances Morris is head of collections international art at Tate. In 1997, she was appointed art program curator for Tate Modern with Iona Blaswick, contributing to the 2-year program of pre-opening projects in and around Bankside. She then oversaw the display of the collection from its opening in 2000 to 2007 as head of displays at Tate Modern. Past exhibitions and catalogs include Tate Modern's retrospective of Yayoi Kusama in 2012 and Louise Bourgeois in 2007. Frances is a director of the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh, a board member of CIMAM, and a member of the advisory committee of the Serralves Museum of Contemporary Art in Porto. So thank you again, and please welcome Phyllida and Frances.
Well, it's wonderful to see an audience of so many friends, visitors to the Tate, artists and colleagues. And I hope we can do you proud tonight. I'm thrilled that Phyllida agreed to be in conversation with me, a long admirer of her work. And I just wanted to add a couple of pieces of important information to Nora's resume of Phyllida's career. To remind you all where it all began, and Phyllida, aged 6, was taken to Paris by her parents. And on a studio visit to an unnamed artist, I'm not sure you recall, her father walked into a pile of stacked glasses, and the chaos and the noise and clutter impressed her hugely. On the very same event, she was introduced to a French latrine for the first time, a hole in the ground, and it was well used apparently. And I love this idea of the kind of mess and broken stuff and bricolage, really being the context for her decision to become, at the age of 6, an artist. 1 year later, she visited to Tate Britain for the first time. So it was the encounter with the studio, rather than the institution, that confirmed her direction. And now, 63 years later, she is Tate Britain. So, on the occasion of Doc, I thought we would start with a discussion of Doc. And in thinking about how we would present this evening, I suggested to Phyllida that she might like to just pick a few works from Tate's collection to go alongside our discussion. And Phyllida has a particular reason for these slides, and so I thought we would begin there.
Yes, it's always like being in a sweet shop, going online, but I made a rule that the works that I would choose were all works that I would have seen at some point. But the reason for perusing the Tate collection and plundering my memory of works was because one of the conditions of the Devine Commission was to try and establish a relationship with Tate Britain and the collection here. And for me, the memories are about sculpture, and very powerful memories about sculpture. So it was important to very much examine what I remembered of the Devine, and how I remembered my relationship coming and going over God knows how many years of sculpture in the Devine, and how that would then relate to my concerns about sculpture, both, I have to say, a kind of hatred of it and a real passion for it. And I don't see those two emotions as incompatible. I think sculpture can fall on its sword, so to speak, and at the same time, as we see, for me, in these works, or this one by Barbara Hepworth, there's an elegant, or this wonderful Phyllida, where there's a sort of attempt to lift, pierce, penetrate, and to sort of eviscerate, but at the same time hold a material in its thrall, in the thrall of this iron, which has obviously been through enormous heat and everything to get it to behave in the way that he wanted to. But there's a lightness of touch, I think, in handling that gravity-bound material that I find fantastic. And I could go through every one, even the Césars, which are all as the Chamberlain, crumpled and pressed, these gestures that are brought to bear on materials that are then caught.
But you were very specifically didn't want to make an installation that would embrace particular works in the collection. You wanted to have the space for you. Is that right?
Oh, yes. No, I think there was a discussion that I would also curate works into the installation, but that became impossible as my work began to take shape in the studio and in terms of my ambitions for the work to use the space.
Did you take on the project before you had the idea? Because in much of the press coverage for the project, there's this, and I think beginning with the piece that in the art newspaper, there's this wonderful quote that I think will probably be now in every single narrative of your work, that you came out of Tate Britain and on the stairs of Millbank looked out, and there you saw this great snaking black shiny river, and as if this was sort of a moment of epiphany, or I think you called it premonition.
Yes.
What was
Well, I think that the way the Devine runs adjacent to the river, it became an incredibly important part of it. The work is not about the river.
So we're not looking
in
for
any shape or
metaphors.
form.
Yes.
Yeah, no, and it's been sort of a hook on which the work has been hung, which is a bit unfortunate, I think.
Yes.
The work is very much about behaviour and gravity and atmospheres around sculpture and looking at sculpture and how sculpture is felt visually. And we almost lose, for me, I almost lose the image of sculpture in the presence of it, because there's a kind of search, a physical search as we walk around it, as well as a visual search. So, but that day, which was a November, I think, so it was getting dark, and it was the Tate was still being rebuilt, so I had to walk round to the steps.
Yes.
And I just sat on the steps, and it seemed that these dark vestigial forms of, I think it was containers, being transported down the river, had something very relevant to my desire to use the huge vaulted space of the Tate and lift sculpture into that space.
Those are the containers that carry rubbish.
Yes, yeah.
All down there. So I can't
yellow
help
as
but
well.
read into the work those sort of references to containers and scaffolding and bricolage, and
exactly.
And you would prefer to distance the work from that.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can't deny that the space and the journey down the space and the journey back the space was hugely important.
Yeah.
And then this idea of relating it to the collection and looking at things that are suspended, like this wonderful Marissa Wertmetz that was just there,
Hang on.
which is, I think, is a recent acquisition, isn't it?
Relatively recent.
Yeah. And is installed in Tate Modern, isn't it, rather than Tate Britain? But I mean, it's something about making us look up into the work instead of looking at it at eye level, that I find enthralling, this way of...
Look, and that's an interesting... can we stop that one? Sorry, this was meant to be a brilliant system, so we could just do whatever we wanted in any combination, and there we have it. Another completely overlooked space being used.
Yes, this is in the basement of Houser and Worth Piccadilly, and it was just the idea of making that space very, very active in all sorts of ways in which people might use it.
I mean, do you get a sort of, is there sort of a pleasure principle from occupying spaces that have never been occupied before by sculpture?
Very, very much so. But also, I think there was a time, maybe in the late earlies, senile, you see, late 80s and early 90s, when I wasn't showing very much. So I sort of took to the streets with the work to find a space that could become an art space just by default.
By virtue of the fact you put something on it?
There, or use street furniture as a plinth for the work and see how long they lasted. And there's one that has still lasted from that time.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Can we go and see it?
You can, but I'm not going to say where it is. and it's made out of silver foil. So it's sort of interesting why, that we can, if we don't have as artists much that enables us to get the work away from the studio, because that's always been very important for me. I think that way of inventing your own space becomes very exciting and actually incredibly liberating. And I found myself sort of secreting works even throwing works into the Thames, which I think was brilliant, actually. Probably not in terms of environmental, ideology.
It's interesting that we've paired Marissa Mertz and your piece at Hauser and thinking about that period of time when you were making work in a way without destination, because you were working in a studio but you didn't necessarily have an exhibition to work towards. And Marissa was somebody who for many years was working at home without, Mario was out doing the exhibition thing, and she was quietly working away at home, making extraordinary work that was never seen, apart from by the people who happened to pass by and
so it does raise the issue of who is the audience for the work, and this kind of horror that, the horror of the audience of one, but I think the audience of one is fantastic, and shouldn't be underrated, and who that audience of one is might have to be the artists themselves.
I might have to ask some technical help in getting these going again.
Is it not? Hang on. Where do you want to go?
I just want to get back onto the loop. Is that back?
I think it is.
Okay, maybe we're back on the loop.
Yeah, there we are.
Well, we were a bit off piece then.
Yes, so there were several things that I wanted to look at for the Davine early on. And I think the Davine experience for me has definitely been before, during and after.
Okay.
And this is after now. Now it's on.
Well, we'll come back to during in a minute, yeah?
Yes, yes. But before, it was the idea of activating the space above us so that the floor space would be vacated. It would be a stage space that would be activated by an audience, or that an audience would be somehow, it would be their territory.
But you are determining the way they negotiate the work, aren't you? Because they have to go under or around.
So I was going to then say that an audience almost becomes collaborators with the work in some way, almost choreographed. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to manipulate an audience, but it was more a question about how sculpture looks at an audience and how we look at sculpture, and there is a sort of symbiotic relationship between the physicality. It's like looking at a mountain and pondering how on earth one's going to climb it. Not that I do, but I think that kind of sense of landscape being something that you can traverse and take a kind of,
as you move through it, it moves in relation to you.
Exactly, yes. I love the idea of the stillness of sculpture and that we are the moving element.
How much do you think, I mean, just talking to you, on previous occasions and reading some of the interviews you've made, it seems that a little bit of that might have to do, I think Martin Creed's project really impacted this idea of this sort of figure moving through the space. It's almost as if you've inverted that and the audience becomes the figure moving through the space. So you're very conscious that it's a journey, a physical journey, and a journey in time. And I think that seems to be important.
I thought that the way Martin used the space in that temporal way and the sound of the feet was absolutely a fantastically sculptural. However we define sculpture, I think it isn't just about a still lump in a space. It's about all sorts of other sensations. The physical sensation of something cutting through that space, as one might cut through a lump of clay or something, seemed to be what he was doing. And I found that very inspirational thinking back to that work.
And also this,
particular.
We were talking earlier about this idea of only realising something significant once it's just passed.
Yes. Yeah.
And so there's always that sort of almost time lag, or which is can be historical time or just momentary time.
Yeah, I think it's quite human, is it, or is it just me, where you sometimes don't quite know how to enjoy something in the moment.
It's in the recollection.
So that holiday, which seemed to be nothing but trauma, and suddenly is quite nice in retrospect. What a miserable person.
Yes, you forget the rain and the children.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
Just because we mentioned Martin's project, but in 60 years of visiting the Duveen, are there other projects that you think somehow reside within it? Because it must be for you as a Londoner and an artist and a visitor, a very loaded space, full of memory.
There was the 54 to 64 exhibition that
Before my
I
time.
think, oh right, were you not born? No. Most people weren't. But I've forgotten who, I've forgotten who curated that, but that was a really stormy exhibition, and it was the one which George Fullard was in, who was the head of sculpture at Chelsea when I was a student there. And I think he fell out with everybody, and I think everybody was at each other's throats in that.
So you were worried about that, were you?
No, I found it absolutely fascinating, but I can't remember if that was the show that had Rauschenberg in it and Larry Rivers and a lot of American artists. I don't think it was that show.
Was the next one.
Yes, the next one. But I mean, those things, seeing the Rauschenberg goat with the tar around it, those sorts of things, and seeing the Oldenburg bedroom with the zebra. I mean, they were made huge impressions.
So they were the sort of paradigm shift moments when you were beginning to decide what you were doing.
Yes, and also really the work that I had loved, a lot of which is shown here, I began to hate. That's what I meant about, I saw it as very didactic and sort of tyrannical in its need to get the skills in a certain way, very well formulated. And as that began to break down during the 60s, it was like being liberated from that. But I think those skills, which, I mean, I bored people to death about this, I learnt them all and then rebelled violently against them because I felt I was no good at them other than handling clay. They've actually given me the independence, to make work. And I think that's probably one of the great things about learning some of these things, even though I think art schools are rapidly unable to do that.
So you learn them to reject them.
Learn them to reject them and abuse them. And I mean, George Fullard was always quoting Picasso as having said, if you're going to use a nail, first of all, you've got to invent the nail. And I think it's a great way makers can think about materials and techniques,
But you don't, I mean, on one of the artists that I know you've included in this PowerPoint, and I know you admire, is Louise Bourgeois. Yes. And she's somebody, it seems to me, that in her mid-years, after making very experimental work in, I don't know where she is, we'll come to her, with sort of found objects. Here we go, stop. And actually you can see in this work, she kind of took on the tradition, rather retrospectively, of carving and of bronze, and kind of made it her own. Rather than the rejection that you've been through.
Yes, she sort of reclaimed it, claimed it.
Yes.
Completely
It
for
mattered
herself.
to her, yes.
But I think there are so many quotes, aren't there, from Louise Bourgeois, her, maybe I'm going to get this wrong, materials are my feelings, although there's a way in which she connected materiality and process to
her
to
memories,
feelings, and I think that therefore the way she engaged with those wasn't just to get something technically immaculate, it was actually how appropriate or how right it would be for that particular work. I mean, her use of black rubber, for instance, I think is incredible, where there's that great sense of weight hanging there with layer, isn't it? It's the layer one that hangs.
So, I mean, I think that's right. She had a sort of almost a vocabulary of materials. Their meaning of each material depended on the meaning of each other material. So there was very much a choice thing. But what about your materials? Because I think it's one of the interesting things about, I mean, you talked about arte povera and the impact of anti-form and that post-minimalist moment and process. And but much of the work of that generation of artists is incredibly sort of poetic. The materials are very poetic and rich in metaphor, because there it might be about history or the body or the landscape. Very rich. Your materials are povera in a different way, aren't they? They're almost, many of them don't even seem to be materials. They're the things that kind of hold materials together. What do you call things like that? Components? Bindings, stuffings?
I think everything really does come from using clay, and materials that can be compressed, stretched, poured, broken, and they're not going to die a death if you do that to them. That there's a lack of, or there's a sense of earthness about them, or they can be treated as an earth-bound material in some way through their handling.
And is it important to you that the handling isn't always predictable?
Yes, it is very.
So when we talked earlier about, you have a sort of foreboding of an idea, that's kind of like, the birthing moment, or not the conception moment, and then there's a process which is where it kind of becomes less controllable, and that
it's very,
evolves.
very uncomfortable, and I'm in that stage in the studio at the moment, and it's as though everything is actually dead, and it's got to be woken up. That everything's very kind of it's just made, it's just produced, and I've got to go in there and turn it around and do all those things that for me make sculpture fascinating, which are terribly sort of traditional. Turn it upside, punch a hole in it, do all those things, and see, in a way, quite childish, and sort of break it down and then rebuild it as though I'm actually rediscovering it in some way.
Is that a very intuitive process?
Yes, but it's also a process that probably has an emotion attached to it, which is frustration.
I mean, the way you mentioned it, I've got to go into the studio, it feels almost there's a sort of like slight
dread.
A total dread. What are you dreading?
That I'm not going to be able to do it. I think it's the artist's ultimate dread, isn't it? It's the dread of the studio door, and getting through it, and facing this this stuff that has no use in the world, is utterly pointless. Why the hell is one doing it?
So once you've gone in with the dread, you put your arms into the clay. When do you feel you can come back out again? Have you resolved something, or it's just...
No, I think resolution of work is not my strong point.
Okay. No. So you come out in the depths of despair?
Yes. No, I come out maybe feeling I managed to generate some actions, and the actions they were okay, those actions, as opposed to maybe the actions not having been okay.
How do you
And these
sleep
are
at
the
night? Terrifying.
bigger works where I'm
Yeah.
working with, say, 4 other people on these ones here. And, you know, I must drive them absolutely nuts with my kind of, can you know, do all this? No, that's not right. Can you know, get the surface darker? Can we put these fillets in, which are the wooden fillets in that hold the surface? Then I come in the next day and say, actually, I really dislike it. Can we smash it with a sledgehammer? And then we sometimes repair it all.
Don't tell me that this was intuition. I mean,
No, it isn't. I don't think it is.
No, but what I mean is that you must have got the project developed in your mind a long way before you were making those sort of decisions.
Yes, I wanted to begin with the blocks.
Yeah.
Because I saw them as, in my relationship with sculpture, as sort of fundamental.
Yeah.
That when minimalism kicked in, I knew I wouldn't belong.
Yes, yes. So is this all revenge?
Yes.
To lift it up and smash it open?
It was then, I mean, minimalism was like this, what you see is what you get, but it came with so much baggage that it was an overwhelming experience, I think. I had a deep envy of being able to reduce something to that simplicity, and also to know that the stuff could be manufactured industrially. It all seemed way out of my experience.
What was the baggage then? Was it the language or the finish or just the reduction to such simple terms?
A lot of the 20th century, the sort of isms that came in, which there's a wonderful catalogue, and I can't remember, with the introduction by Lawrence Alloway, and it's bringing to the Tate for the first time a load of minimalist artists, and there was the famous Robert Morris installation.
Yes.
But in his writing, if you read it, he doesn't mention the word minimalism once.
That's right.
So it's when these isms get attached to something, and then it's like the morality kicks in. You must do this and you mustn't do that.
Yes.
The rules,
yes, you
exactly.
have to conform.
And I've always found that with a sort of art historical lineage really troublesome. You know, and immediately my instinct has been no.
Yeah. And I suppose there was a particular straitjacket around minimalism as well.
Yes, yes.
More so than perhaps other isms.
Yes, there seemed to, but I mean, even with surrealism, you know, they all ended up at each other's throats. And it's that kind of need to create a kind of false order out of something that has a degree of flexibility in it from the start, you know. And that's what I think was so fantastic about Bruce Nauman, you know, who decided to take theatricality to a new limit in the arts, I think. Yeah.
So the 2 or 3 big hanging containers, when I earlier said I saw, if one was looking for a connection with the history of the Devines, it seemed to me like you'd taken those big Richard Serras that we had in the Devines and lifted them up, and showed that actually they were light as a feather.
Yes, and also, there's a lot of a kind of devious manipulation of maybe that art history by saying we, you know, polystyrene actually can behave in this way, and you can puncture this formidable cubist block, you know.
So that coming back to polystyrene, we were talking about earlier. I was talking about materials that, you know, have a kind of aura about them, and your materials that don't. I mean, they have a kind of B&Q it aura, but beyond that, they really are things that feel as if they've come out of the shed, don't they?
Yeah, but I think they're not that unusual. I mean, they're very usual materials for sculptors to use. A lot of sculptors. I remember going down to the foundry in East London that Barry Flanagan used, and they had all his armatures there of the giant hares, and they were all steel with great cloths of
Yeah.
polystyrene before. This was after
But they were the
car-
amateurs.
I know, but that they're still a material,
Yeah.
and I think for me, revealing those kind of temporary fixes that sculptors have used is very important for me. And of course, Picasso was casting cardboard
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
bronze.
Yeah.
way
I
back,
mean,
yeah.
I think that what's wonderful about this is that the wrapping materials are, as you say, they're wrapping materials that our sculpture studio is full of.
Yes.
This is the stuff of sculpture.
Yes,
It's how
yes, yeah.
we wrap it. It's a
I mean,
sculptural material.
Richard Deacon is very
Yes. He's somewhere along the line.
articulate about this, about sheet materials, he calls them, you know, and how his use of them way back in the 70s, the fact that they were so manipulable, you know, you could bend them. And also, I remember him saying that sheet materials could be in any length you wanted, you know, you weren't necessarily
You weren't
confront.
bound.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
But
So,
when you first started experimenting in those early years with sort of pauvre materials, they were principally discarded materials?
yes, they were
Yeah.
materials that I salvaged,
Yes.
not just from the street, but from various sources that I became familiar with. Like there was fire damage materials that were placed. A lot of these places are no longer. I can remember the shift when they could no longer do this, like the rag industry
Yes.
suddenly changed and you couldn't get rags anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it was all sort of health and safety and
Yeah.
all those
So
kinds of things.
that shift in your work from sort of found or thrown away materials to, as it were, bought materials in bulk and packing materials is really purely utilitarian. I mean, that's
Well,
just,
it was economic at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
When I was salvaging materials and recycling sculptures,
Yeah.
and nothing really got. The sculptures just all got destroyed,
Yeah.
you know, because I was constrained financially. So that was a way of
Yeah.
keeping things going,
Yeah.
you know.
So these, in this installation, 100 yards long, 7 sculptures. These are the sculptures not for recycling.
No. Mm.
Why sculptures, not installations? What's the difference in your mind? I mean, some people might think on the scale that these would qualify as,
Well, I can imagine the 5 suspended crates
yeah,
being taken down to some vast expanse of estuary or something, and just seeing them there. They're not site specific in
Right.
that
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
and none of the work is.
Yeah.
Yes, dimensions of spaces are incredibly important at the time of making, but they're not made to be owned by the space. So
And yet there does seem to be a dialogue, or seems to me to have been a dialogue, in the placing of these, not just in the space, but in relation to things that you might see as you walk through the space. So, for example, the juxtaposition of the central piece, which is the painted piece with Anthony Caro,
Yes.
seems to just beg the question of painting and sculpture.
absolutely, and also the fact that one of the conditions was to relate to the collection, and that just seemed like a gift.
So that was where you ticked that box.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because obviously Caro looms so large in the history of British sculpture.
Yes.
It must be impossible not to have a position in relation to him and a moving position over time.
I just always think back to the British artists who sort of migrated to America to touch the cloth of the American artists, and then came back almost like evangelists. And I think you got it in you also got it with Joseph Beuys. I remember the performance he did
Yes,
here.
yeah.
And it was like he was surrounded by this wall of absolute devotees. And I took one look and just fled.
Yes.
And I think it's that thing that if it's this bloody hard to become a member of this club, then I'm not even going to try. You know?
Failure. We're talking about failure, you see.
Yes, or a kind of bloody mindedness,
Yes,
that
yes.
there's another way of... I think
You didn't
there
want to
is-
be a groupie.
No,
Good for you.
no, and I think the extraordinary thing about St. Martin's, where he was
Yeah.
this extraordinary presence, that there was this other course going
Yes,
on
yeah.
that was in a way, I think, again, to use that word, symbiotic to the very formal rigours of the Anthony Caro legacy,
Yeah.
which now that I'm not part of that time, I can see the real elegance and the incredible sort of amount of free drawing in his work, and absolutely love it. But
You didn't see it then?
no, I didn't.
But
you
so
know,
how
but
would
I
you
think
describe how would you describe, if you can, the response in your work to that kind of stance?
I think it was to do with malleability
Yeah,
and
yeah.
to do with my ability to, in a way, be very present in the work in a very bodily, tactile way,
yeah.
and not a kind of stand back and
Yeah.
admire way. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that that's what he did, but
No,
there
that's what
seemed
you
to
saw
be,
in it at that time.
yes, there
Yeah.
seemed to be a lot of genuflection in front of work, you
Yeah.
know, and a lot of talk about great work.
Yeah.
And I remember just finding that oppressive, this endless notion of good work and bad work
Yeah.
and huge systems of judgmentalism
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
And I think there were other artists. I mean, I think Richard Long at that time was, when he was sort of shaking hands in Amalfi,
Amalfi.
yes,
Yes,
and
brilliant.
doing things that were very, in relationship to Martin Creed,
Yeah.
were quite, there's a sort of symbiosis there. I think there were people who were turning their backs on that kind of authoritarianism, but probably, to use that word that I don't really know what it means, in a very conceptual way, and I knew I wasn't that kind of artist.
Yes. So
there
you were
was
kind of finding your way between those.
Yes,
oppositions,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I think trying to hang on to the physicality of making.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting I think reading an interview that you'd done, you talked about your first encounter with sort of, Eva Hesse and the Italians as being through photographs. And I think it's very interesting the way that three-dimensional work can impact through its translation into two dimensions and into the photograph.
Yes.
And thinking about the way Picasso impacted on David Smith was purely through, flat photographs in Cahiers d'Art. What was your first encounter with real arte povera? And
It
work
must
in the
have
flesh?
been really quite late on. Was it 71?
Yeah,
I think.
69, 71
Well,
would have been,
yes. When was the wonderful show at
So
the
would it have been
ICA?
when
Yeah.
Attitudes became full?
Yes, it was,
Yeah,
yes.
which was 70...
I thought it was
74?
69.
The exhibition? Can't remember. But around that time.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so you saw that show.
Yeah, and that was just,
Yeah,
it
Charles's
was
show.
absolutely,
And was it like a discovery?
but I'd been seeing Barry Flanagan's work, and there were also these artists who people probably hadn't heard of, Martin Naylor
Yes.
and Carl Plackman.
Yeah.
There were British artists who were trying to fragment their work, trying to explore the poetics of materiality and space without it being controlled by a sculptural language that had sort of come from a much more traditional, you could say conventional lineage. And I think it was that was so appealing about Barry Flanagan's work, that was the physicality of the work still retained something of a sculptural language, but it had no, it didn't obey the rules of what the legacy of Henry Moore had imposed in a way.
It's interesting because it almost feels as if that was the last moment of the last great paradigm shift in contemporary art. That sort of
60s.
Yeah, that post-minimalist moment. And you picked up on that very...
I think that was the artistic shift.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's... I mean, the 20th century now, it seems like this box of lucky dip goodies, can just put your hand in.
Well, I think maybe for younger artists,
Oppenheim.
that's what it is, possibly.
Yes,
It is. It's a
yeah.
toolkit.
Yes,
Or Pandora's box, whichever way you look at it on it.
Yes.
But this must have felt very exciting, this moment.
I think there were things going on that were very hierarchical. Everybody says the 60s were fantastic. Fabian, my husband, and I, we hated the 60s. Partly, but I think we were just we were sort of very ordinary. We didn't.
You were poor.
And we didn't do drugs.
No, and you had 5 children or
and
something
we didn't,
tremendous.
As far as I know, he didn't have many mistresses, so that maybe I'm left. And I certainly didn't have whatever the opposite to that is. So I think it was that sort of thing of being kind of slightly on the edge of something.
So it's exactly this thing about only noticing once it's passed.
Yes.
I was part of that.
Yeah.
Where I made that happen.
And maybe the things that really made an impact were actually where are the changes, what's going to change, what's going to give. And I think it was those things, both in terms of art and in life, that were very significant about that time. But the kind of the sort of roles that were being acted out around that, I think were quite sort of tedious.
Yes,
in
I'm
a
sure
way.
they were. Yeah. The institutional roles, the hierarchies.
Yes, and
the
whether
teaching
that
profession.
was in the hippie community or in the you've got to take LSD community or whatever it is. Those kind of rule makers set themselves up very quickly, I think.
So just sort of following the mythology that surrounds your career, you spent the 70s and 80s beavering away in the studio with your arms plunged into a lump of clay.
Well, it wasn't, by then it was not clay.
No,
it was being
plaster
translated into paper and
But doing a lot of
and
work that there was your own practice, recycling, sometimes having shows. I mean, you had steady presentations, but without mostly teaching. What then, when you started doing less teaching and exhibiting on a much broader scale, really alongside a much younger generation, did you find a huge shift in that cultural context? I mean, do you find it a more liberating, open...
Now?
Yes.
Yes, I think it's... But I think younger artists have their work cut out for them. Because I think my generation was exceptionally lucky to have the teaching, and it really did enable me to work and...
you mean as an artist that to teach and work was an option?
Yes, and that was what it was all about until the early 70s, when there was the inevitable sort of recession and everything, and then it all changed and it became very tough.
Beyond that, do you think those institutional hierarchies, those the clubs, the language has disappeared or reduced so that there's a more open environment in which to make work?
I'm not so sure. I think there's a lot of open thinking, but I think the struggle to make work is now so economically driven. It seems far worse than when we all left art school in the 60s, where it was possible to get spaces and studios reasonably cheap. I think now just the way of making work is controlled about how you're able to afford it.
Okay.
I'm not saying it wasn't then, but I think there was a looser...
Now, obviously the really major shift in your practice has been from this, in a way, studio-based practice, which was often you and the work, sometimes making it for a place on the street or on a sofa, and then deconstructing it and remaking it in a sort of almost hermetically sealed sort of bubble, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
You and the work, you and the materials. And now you're making work for other people, audiences, but also collectors, and work that won't be recycled and needs to be...
But I never think I'm making this work for a collector.
No. Are you sure?
Absolutely.
But you're making a work that will exist in the world.
Yes.
So does that change the equation at all? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you've been making work for such a long time that you're just making work.
That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And if the work does sell, it's fantastic,
Yeah.
because that does all sorts of
Yeah.
things. You know, it helps run the studio. It means more work can be made. I mean, I'm not saying, I just want to return this question a bit about the whole idea of selling work. I just want to find out what the audience thinks as well. Should artists not sell work? Is there such a high idealism expected of artists that they are making work in a vacuum that has no economic... I mean, then how are artists meant to live?
I'm not... I didn't mean... selling is the wrong thing. What I meant was that it seemed to be previously a sort of endless cycle of making destruction and remaking. Okay? Because you were recycling your work, and there'd be a point at which it would be momentarily fixed, and then you would remake it. So the question is not about selling. The question is that when do you know that something's finished?
I don't. I sometimes, with these smaller works, which I think you saw, introduce these stands or plinths that are very much part of the work, because I wanted to be in control of how these works would be shown. And that introduction of a plinth-like object that would hold the work seemed to be a way where some kind of conclusion could be reached.
So you're sort of having to set up a situation whereby you can draw the thing to a kind of halt.
Yeah, because I think if you use these materials like plaster, cement, clay, they lend themselves almost to a sort of layering process, or a pouring process, or a breaking process. So they lend themselves to being continued and being continued, almost as if it's like archaeology in reverse, if you know what I mean.
I mean, whenever I've curated exhibitions, what I really wanted to be able to do is on the end of the show, I wanted to go back in and rehang it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, is there a bit of you that would just like to have 3 weeks?
Yeah, definitely.
Should we try and arrange that?
Yes. I think it's not at all right. You know, there are things that are not right about it, for me, if there is such a thing as right and wrong. But that's the spur for the next show or the next work, you know. That's what really is the kick, you know.
That seems a very good moment to pause and see if there's any questions from the audience, I think. How would they finish it?
I would...
Anthony, I think there's a roving mic.
This is really just a comment. You spoke about selling work, making work for clients, etc. It always seemed to me, as a matter of truth, that an artwork was completed when it left the studio, was exhibited, and went somewhere else, preferably to a good place like Tate Britain. But I felt that the process of it going away, becoming something else, becoming part of the public, becoming part of public consciousness, and having a new owner was absolutely essential to the making of the work of art, and that was part of the work of art.
I must admit that when I've done exhibitions, I've done as much as I can. Walking away from them is absolutely wonderful. And in a way, I haven't been back to Doc, this show, that much. And that's just the way I am. So the fact that some works end up in places that I don't know where they are, I have to say I don't mean this as an insulting thing to people who buy my work, but it's sort of no interest to me. I don't know if that sounds extremely ungrateful or whatever, but it just isn't, because
I don't believe you.
Oh, really?
It's not
What do
true.
you say to that?
I don't know how to convince you.
You can't, because it's not true.
But how can I possibly... The thing that's of interest to me is the relationship I have with it when it's being made. Then when it leaves the studio, that's an edgy time. Then when it goes to the place...
That's just your daughter getting married.
No, no, that was a disaster. We'll go into that later. How can I convince you?
There's a question here.
Thank you very much. You say your works aren't site-specific, but there always seems to be a very intense engagement with the space. Obviously, you have to work within the space, but it's more than just citing things here or there. It's dangling them from the roof or putting them in particular. You're enabled by the space that you're working in. Do you feel there is a stronger relationship between the site and your work than you may have brought out so far?
It's the work is initiated by the location, particularly the dimension. They fascinate me, the height, length, width, breadth, etc., and the way the space gets used. So those things are very important as a kind of trigger to how the work might sit or make use of the space, and the space make use of the work, actually, as well, that way around. But I don't think that isn't the whole work, because the way the work gets produced is, in a way, casting a view to that, but not dependent on that. So I always think, I don't know what the definition of site specificity is, but there often seems to be a kind of narrative that goes with it, that I'm always trying to detach myself from a narrative that holds the work to the space, if that makes any sense.
Hello.
Hi.
I wanted to ask, is there a specific place for every single piece of wood and every single position that you have there? And I would like to ask you for the meaning of that piece, actually.
This one,
Where does
yeah.
the title dock, and also specifically that the pile on the left, is there a specific position for every one of those pieces
As
of
good
wood?
as I could do it, yes. I was directing 4 people to set it up, and it took, I think, two goes at doing it. So I wouldn't say that it was specific in the sense that if a piece was moved 2 centimeters to the left, it would be a disaster. So the thing is, in a way, more like a gesture, more like throwing something, spilling something across a space. And maybe some splashes aren't exact. And I think the processes of making are very like that. But then there's also, from my point of view, there's a real sense of me making judgments the whole time about those gestures.
Was it planned in your studio, piece by piece?
Yes, yeah, but not, I never saw them joined together or set up because there wasn't the space until we brought everything to the Devines. So I was working very much with a kind of rebound from one work to another in a very formal way. If things had a kind of horizontality, then I knew I wanted something that was a riposte to that, that was very vertical, or something that was very flat. So there was a lot of using that kind of language of comparison and dislocation, really. But the idea of exactness, I'm very interested in approximation, things that are approximately what they are, rather than exactly what they are, if that makes any sense.
I'm intrigued how you knew how much of pieces of wood and bits that you would need to fill that space in advance.
I think that's where the issue of dimension came in. I knew that it was 5 meters out and 7 meters across, and I knew that I wanted it to be about 3 meters high when it reached the wall, and so that I could, it wasn't a difficult calculation to make how much material I needed to bring into the space to fill that area. Yeah.
Is there a significance of the type of dock?
It means, to me, a dock is something where things arrive and depart from. There's a restlessness about it. And I like the idea that sculpture for me is very still, but that because they're suspended, they're hung, there's for me a sense of ambiguity about whether they've arrived, whether they're coming or going. So a dock is a place where things shift. And I suppose that's my relationship with making sculpture, is it's constantly shifting, constantly changing. And something maybe about the times we're living in as well, a sort of uncertainty. So I was trying to bring quite a few things together, but very related to trying to bring to sculpture something that had a sense of ebb and flow about it. Thank you. Hi.
Do you feel that there is an element of danger in some of your work? There's a sort of threatening quality.
Yes.
Not just because of that. And I mean, is that part of the time that we're living in? Because there is a sort of close to chaotic quality, close to collapse, and in some of the darker pieces, like the big knocks.
Look at that. Sorry, the Giacometti, the Richier there.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in sculpture which isn't, I mean, I love the block and I love the idea of the form emerging out of the block, but I also love the sense that if you make sculpture, you're also working with gravity and you're working with time, and they both cast a very unpredictable, they are unpredictable in how they challenge the way I make work. And so using that to, in a way, kind of evidence danger, I find thrilling. So I think there is that in the work. And I think there's a lot of sculptors do sort of play with that edge, you know, of where and how the work will stand or sit or be hung. There's an element of, is this going to work? Can this happen?
How do you use colour within that remit of?
I think the colour is I mean, I think the colours are off the street, you know, that they're colours that seek attention in the way that notices and information are often in very bright colours and often quite unusual colours. You know, I'm always using the example that scaffolding poles are often, and the boards that go on scaffolding are often painted pink at the end, which seems a very unusual colour in a construction industry, you know, but you see these surprising colours around the street that are used in a very expedient, sort of matter-of-fact way, but they're often sort of pretty colours, and I like that contrast between something having quite an industrial labour association and also a pretty association as well.
I often think of your work as being a little bit larger than life and almost a bit cartoony and kind of moving away from reality.
I think scale, I always think of my work as not using scale but using size. I think scale is an illusionary quality and size is a very factual thing. I don't, compared with something else in the natural world or with a shipyard, my work is tiny, you know. And I think, therefore, size is a very peculiar, movable, and rather unpredictable quality, actually. It's one of the things about size is that it's very much in the present. It's the now of how you're experiencing it. And that's how, in a way, I wanted to use the divine, very much in the present tense. I think the syntax of sculpture is absolutely fascinating, whether you're seeing it in the present or whether it's the thing you've just seen becomes in the past and the thing you're about to see is in the future. I think, for me, that's a bit different from the experience of looking at painting. But I'm trying to join up the dots of your question. Are you saying the size makes them have a kind of cartoon-like element? Yes. I'm quite interested in that.
I think it also maybe adds a kind of fiction to them.
Right, yes. I think the size, the sort of idea of the inflated object is comical. And I think in that sense, for me, sculpture has a very absurd role. And that's, I suppose, how I would see it, as having that it's absurd in the size it is within that particular space. Thank you.
Hi, I work in the gallery and I often find that people ask me if they can climb on it and they can touch it. And I'm just curious to know how you feel about that sort of response to your artwork, and do you have any other artworks where people can do that, or is there always this reverence of an art gallery culture where people aren't to touch? It's not particularly in that audience relationship.
Touch is an amazing what do you call it, sense. But I think to imagine touching something is a language, and I think it's not, it needs to be aired more. I don't think you have to touch sculpture to get your imagination going and see touch as a language that you can imagine what it is, imagine whether it's cold or hot. With this particular work, I'm amazed at how untouched it is. I was quite looking forward to sort of traces of human hands on the wooden columns and things. Yeah, they're not...
That is the rules. No touch.
Yeah.
Watch it.
Yeah.
You can tell a story about the...
Yeah, and the Tate very kindly contacted Julia at the gallery, and she wrote to me very politely saying, sorry, I have some terrible news for you, or something like that.
The work has been damaged.
Yeah, and I thought, oh God, it's fallen down or something and killed something. No, but then it was a piece of polystyrene had come off one of the blocks. I think it's about that big, and there's a little felt tip squiggle on the cardboard. And so I'm amazed that so far is the only damage. Do feel free when you
Cut.
I mean, I feel very strongly about sculpture not being touched, oddly enough, even though the work is an open invitation to be climbed on and everything. I think how we use our imaginations about touch, to me, is absolutely fascinating, you know, because I think it's an underused language. You know? And it's interesting, if you think of paintings, do paintings get wanting to be touched as much as sculpture does? You know, where are these boundaries, you know, I think sculpture has this thing of occupying the space that we occupy, and therefore there's, in a way, a kind of challenge to our own physicality straight away, I think, with sculpture. Thank you.
Phyllida, one of the things that I really love about your work is the kind of improvisatory quality and a sort of performative quality. And there's one artist that I'm curious isn't in your slideshow, who I think prepared the way for me, for my own response to your sculpture. And that's Franz West.
Well, I couldn't find any Franz West in the Tate collection.
But we have a great one.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
But I think
We showed it in 2000 when we opened.
God.
It's got a Pashtuk and wonderful
Oh,
drawings.
yes.
And, yes.
But I think, yes, and I did see it, but I think the image, it says no image available.
No
so you're
copyright.
absolutely right. No, he's absolutely top of my list, and I'm glad you've mentioned him, but I couldn't. The early stuff, absolutely,
yes, the sort of performative sculptures.
Incredible, yeah, the ones that you, that one that I think shown at the Listen that you could pick up and.
It seems to me that even though you talked about the spectator, you wanting the spectator to be in a performative relation to the sculpture.
Yes, yes.
I mean, they're not literally part of the sculpture in performance, but I think that feeling of your bodily response and relation is performative on the part of the spectator, and it's really very, very important.
I think
that,
you're right.
A kind of improvisation as well. So that's all I really wanted to say.
Thank you. That's great. And the kind of problems I have with the audience or a potential audience when I'm making the work is like I don't want to think about it but when the work is there, they become this. They become the protagonists, you know, for the work, and it's like a revelation. And when I was installing this work, it was fantastic being in such close contact with the people who were wandering through and watching it, you know, going up, and it was exciting actually, you know, and the range of comments from horror to excitement. I mean, that's all part of it, you know. Yeah, thank you. That's great.
I was just wondering what's going to happen to the work when it's finished. Will it be destroyed in that?
Apart from the timber, all the timber will come back to the studio.
So totally in that cycle of make, destroy,
Yes,
make, destroy.
yeah. Because in some ways, for me, it's been, following on from what Roger has said, it's been as much an event as it being a sculptural, being about sculpture. It's being
kind
also
of relieved by that in one way, but saddened in another.
So I will salvage what I can from it, but not.
Sounds like the title of your next work, doesn't it? Are there any additional questions?
I'm just curious to know a bit more about how you feel about the transition from the studio to presenting the work, particularly with Doc, having been lucky enough to see the work in the studio. Everything was so densely packed, and beautiful to see the work like that and being produced, and then going to such a huge space. I just wondered how that process makes you feel, and if it alters how you feel about the work, and perhaps how you feel about the work now.
Well, as you know, because you've had the misfortune to handle some of it, but the smaller works are they're just ongoing, and I think I've got about 6 small works all on the go at the moment, and I don't know what state they're in. Meanwhile, I've got these other bigger works for the show in Dallas in USA next, whenever it is. But I think there's this extraordinary things with the bigger works, that all the bigger works have a level of production that is also very intimate, that I'm very close with it. So that shift from the sort of ebb and flow of the smaller works to the bigger works, when it's in the studio, it never seems that challenging, if you know what I mean, because it's still within my grasp physically, and also having the assistants there to help with the difficult sides of it, like the weight or whatever it is. So there's a way of keeping that very intimate, but that's completely blown out of the water when it hits a space like the Devine. It suddenly becomes physically sort of beyond my control. And I have to say, there's something very exciting about that transition. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but...
Does it feel the same?
Do you mind waiting for the mic?
Sorry.
No, I could hear you, Rob.
Well, you were saying earlier about when you produce or you've got objects made in the studio, and then you go in and you puncture through them, or you deconstruct them and then reconstruct them. Whereas with a piece like Doc, you've obviously got it very, there's pre-planned, but was... Do you...
There wasn't, the staircase had a lot of improvised way of being made that was not tested at all in the studio. So that was very much begun and then taken apart and then begun again. Quite a few of them were, but that was as far as it went. There wasn't any drastic remaking in the space. So there was a certain sort of expectation of the work that was quite, is actually a way I do work with the bigger ones, that they go through a real trial and error process, and then they become quite focused.
And you're, when you're in the studio and you don't know what is going to happen if you puncture a hole through something, or that's at the same time as being quite scary, it's probably quite exciting. But do you feel the same when you're in the space? Do you feel the same worry and sort of excitement?
Yeah, because then it shifts and it becomes almost like going on stage and being told you've got to play Hamlet, but no one's given you the script. There is a kind of, you know what the play is, but you've had no time to rehearse it. And that's what really, for me, generates the excitement. It shifts from the process, the excitement being in the ebb and flow of how to make the things, to in now what's going to happen in the installation, in the installation of the work. But they somehow reciprocate each other. That makes,
Should we make this the last one?
I'm intrigued to know how you assemble the construction on the right, for example. Do you have a scaffold? Do you walk all around it? Do you consider it from above? Do you get up high on scaffold boards and look down on it from above and consider it from all angles? Do you pop bits in? You talk about 4 people that did the work for you.
Yeah, we added a lot to it when it
But
was...
how do you get involved with looking at it? Do you ever look at it from above? Do you
No,
walk all around it?
I can't stand on a chair without getting vertigo.
So it's only meant to be
So I think
so it's only meant to be seen from below.
part of my love of height is the fact that I can't do it. And I think there is a peculiar emotional thing there about it. But no, these are very much about a kind of premonition, I think Francis was saying, of something, and that is what drives the work. So there is, as Rob was saying, the installation is, there is a certain amount of tension about whether these things are actually going to perform, for want of a better word, you know, because there isn't any way in which they're tried out. I made those crate things at this sort of height in the studio, and they were literally, it was literally the gesture of throwing stuff in it and seeing how they landed in them. And then when we got them here and got them to that height, we had to throw more stuff into them. So they were very dependent on a simple gesture of things being thrown.
Do they fall down?
They did fall down in the studio. I haven't heard of them falling down here. But, no, I mean, yeah, no, I've had a few disasters, yeah, where things have fallen down. Yeah.
And of course, what is wonderful is that there are parts of all these sculptures that nobody will ever see,
yes,
not even you.
Yes.
So there is still that sort of mystery and secret and
yeah, and I think
future.
that is sculpture for you,
and
isn't
you've
it?
talked
Yeah.
about wanting to show people the underside of the feet. You know, there's that aspect of lifting it up. But in doing that, you also create this... which is...
Exactly, yeah. So it's a paradox.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think Phyllida has been enormously generous with her time
so have you.
and just wonderfully open and a revelation. If this was an interview, I would now ask you whether you had any questions for us. Here is your audience, the audience you fear so much. Do you have a question for them?
Well, loads, but
Maybe over a drink.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francis, very much. Thank you.